When one thinks of pickups from the Chrysler Corporation, you often think about brands like Dodge and Ram, and for those who live in Canada, maybe Fargo. But one of the things that often doesn't come to mind when pickups are being discussed is the Plymouth division. And that's precisely what makes this vehicle so fascinating, because in fact, Plymouth did offer a pickup truck, and it was only in the market for 1 year, 1983. And that is what you see here, the Plymouth Scamp. Now I know some of you are saying the Scamp? Well, wasn't that kind of a sportier Valiant? Yes, it was in the 1970s, but the name was resurrected for the, let's call it, less than beautiful vehicle that you see here depicted. And what makes this story even more remarkable is that only 3,564 units of the Plymouth Scamp were ever produced, making it one of the rarest pickup trucks ever manufactured by an American automaker. In fact, you were more likely to see a Ferrari on the road in 1983 than encounter one of these peculiar little trucks. And despite the homely looks, which we'll get to in a second, I think the Plymouth Scamp and its sister, the Dodge Rampage, it's hard to believe it was called the Dodge Rampage, especially once we talk about the engines under hood, represent something genuinely innovative for their time. In any case, the Dodge Rampage was marketed for 3 model years, 1982, 1983, and 1984. And these were 2 sister pickups that I think actually were kind of based on something that, to some degree, made sense. And that was that these are actually variants of the Chrysler L-Body or the Omni Horizon front-wheel drive vehicles. Front-wheel drive, I should say, and unibody vehicles. The Omni and Horizon would be the first Chrysler front-wheel drive products produced in the United States. And they would also really lead the pack in the US in terms of transversely mounted engines and transmissions and compact packages for economy vehicles, particularly given they came out in the late 1970s. It took GM, as an example, all the way until 1980 to really come out with its offering, at least in terms of the transversely mounted engine and transmission front-wheel drive vehicles. That was of course the X-Cars, the Citation, the Phoenix, the Omega, and the Skylark. But here you have actually pretty novel for the time, a front-wheel drive and unibody pickup that was based on that kind of quirky, funky-looking Omni Horizon, which, I can't believe this, I had to look it up. The Omni and Horizon were actually produced all the way through the 1990 model year. Can you imagine seeing one of these in a dealership in 1990, when things like the Ford Taurus are in like other competitive showrooms? Boy, this car just looks so dated, but it lasted a long time, and I think they sold about 2.5 million Omni and Horizons over the car's lifetime, so it was a great seller. And then it started, let's say, spawning different variants, one of which is what you see here. Now unfortunately, while great kind of on paper, the Plymouth Scamp and Dodge Rampage, well, let's just say had a few challenges overall. Now the first thing that you notice about the Scamp is it has that face that only a mother could love. This kind of anteater underbite. I don't know how else you would describe that fascia. And it's a big fascia too. Notice that the sheet metal terminates a lot further back from where the bumper is. So this was the era of bumper impact standards. And I'm sure that that helped with it. But this has a face, kind of like the Mercury LN7 of the early 1980s. Which is not to say that it's a great face. I'm not usually a fan of cars with a severe underbite. And this one certainly needs to go to the orthodontist's office, especially with that ice cube tray style grille up front. Well, hey, at least you got a Chrysler emblem atop the hood. And what's particularly interesting about this front end design is that Plymouth engineers actually had to redesign the door glass door seals and glass drop mechanisms specifically for the Rampage and Scamp, because the prototype was built with the 024 Turismo windshield and 4-door sedan front doors. But those didn't fit together properly, creating unique engineering challenges that added to the development costs. Interestingly, they went with the so-called barbell theme on the vehicle here, where the outer ends are fatter than the midsection of the car. I guess that was probably trying to make it look more powerful, in keeping with its pickup truck, let's say, desires and aspirations. Although you really couldn't tow much with these, they were true kinda half-ton pickups. It could carry over 1,100 pounds of payload in the bed, but you weren't towing a lot with a unibody pickup, unless you just wanted to shred your body. And speaking of body, these are kind of a bit funny looking. In this particular side view, looks like it needs a significantly longer wheelbase. The front overhang is enormous, and that really is because of the front-wheel drive proportions. You don't have the dash to axle that you would have on some of the rear-wheel drive pickups. And then the rear wheel, I guess it looks about okay. It could be a little bit further rearward, but the front wheel, I think, to my eye, certainly needs to be pushed further forward. It just looks a little funky. Now I will say that this car is a pretty plain Jane styled vehicle. You have that one body side crease that runs the entire length of the vehicle. But aside from that, you really don't have too much. You just have this graphics package with the stripe on this particular Scamp. And otherwise, the surfacing is not very complicated. The most complicated portion is the front end, which you previously saw. I do like the B-pillar and how it transitions into the top of the pickup truck bed with that, nice fillet, I would say there, with a pretty big radius to it. And this design element was actually one of the few universally praised aspects of the Scamp's styling, as it created a smooth visual connection between the cab and the bed area, which was challenging given the unibody construction. The engineers had to ensure structural rigidity while maintaining that flowing appearance, which required some clever metalworking techniques that were relatively advanced for Chrysler's budget-conscious approach at the time. Now let's take a look at kind of a rear three-quarter view of a different Scamp. This one doesn't have that same graphics package, but it does have the blacked-out lower section to give the car a bit of a slimming look. Also, notice how high the body sits in the back relative to the wheels. I suppose this was done so that the body could compress on the springs if it were carrying payload capacity. You can see the bumper is also pretty big, kind of a tack-on piece, and I do think it's interesting how they integrated the drip rail here on the vehicle, just above the glass, and then they continued it further rearward as opposed to terminating it when the glass stopped. So it's got a little bit of an eyebrow there on the B-pillar. One thing I also find a bit humorous is, well, this clearly was not a heavy-duty pickup, and one of the ways that you could tell that is the lug nuts. There are only 4 lug nuts per wheel here, so this was not going to be carrying any intense payload anytime soon. And this 4-lug configuration was borrowed directly from the Omni and Horizon passenger cars, which further emphasized the car-based nature of this pickup truck. In fact, the wheels themselves were identical to those used on the base model Omni, which helped Chrysler save on tooling costs, but also meant that aftermarket wheel options were extremely limited for owners who wanted to customize their Scamps. Though the GT model did offer special 14-inch alloy wheels that were chosen by only 308 GT buyers, making them extraordinarily rare today. Now out back in your Scamp, you got these vertical tail lamps that flank the tailgate, and some kind of old-school Plymouth block lettering that interestingly contrasted with the, I'll call it playful, casual Scamp lettering there on the tailgate itself. So those badges really seem incongruent to me, the Plymouth font and the Scamp font. But hey, this was a lower-end car, and they probably were trying to just have a little bit of fun with it. These vertical taillights were actually shared components with other Chrysler L-body vehicles, which again demonstrates the parts bin engineering approach that kept costs down. And interestingly, the tailgate itself was constructed from lightweight stamped steel rather than the heavier gauge materials used in traditional pickup trucks, which contributed to the Scamp's relatively light curb weight of around 2,300 pounds. And here's a fascinating detail. The Plymouth Scamp actually recycled the metal Scamp badge from 1973 to 1976 Valiant-based Scamp, leading to speculation that Chrysler had warehouses full of leftover badges and created this pickup variant partly as a way to use them up. The pickup bed itself measured just over 5 feet in length, which was reasonably generous for such a compact vehicle, and the bed floor was constructed with reinforcement ribs that helped distribute weight evenly across the unibody structure. The bed featured integrated tie-down hooks at all 4 corners, and the sides were designed with a slight taper to facilitate loading and unloading. What's particularly noteworthy is that despite the unibody construction, the bed could handle the advertised 1,100-pound payload capacity without structural flexing, thanks to strategically placed reinforcement beams that connected the bed floor to the main body structure. However, the shallow bed depth of only 15 inches meant that anything you loaded had better be secured well, or it would be visible and potentially vulnerable to theft, which is why so many Scamp owners opted for aftermarket bed toppers. And as we turn to the inside of the Scamp, well, it wasn't necessarily a horrible place to be, but it certainly wasn't a place of luxury as you would expect in a cheap pickup. But you notice that, kind of typical for the time, Chrysler Omni Horizon steering wheel, the four-spoker there, with no badging in the middle, so that way you didn't feel bad. Or Chrysler could save some money, because they didn't have to change the badge between Plymouth and Dodge. It was just a generic four-spoke wheel. Chrysler did that during this time frame. Sometimes their steering wheels didn't have badges. I've seen two-spoke Chrysler wheels that also didn't have badges, and then their wheel covers sometimes were not badged, so they could use them across the lineup, where they would say Chrysler Corporation on them or something. That would apply to many different vehicles. Now you did get bucket seats in this particular Scamp, as you can see, and they were decently comfortable. But these cars, I would say, or these pickups, are relatively noisy on the inside. As you would suspect, they have almost no sound deadening. And back in this time frame, when a customer bought a cheap low-end car or a pickup truck like this, they really weren't expecting all that much refinement. That was a pleasant delight in the event that the vehicle was refined. They were really just looking for something that was useful and could haul some light loads from A to B and do so fuel efficiently, or I should say with fuel efficiency. So that was really the name of the game here, not NVH, or noise, vibration, and harshness refinement. In a super cheap pickup of this time frame, I would say the base price of these Scamps was $6,991, which if you adjusted for inflation today, would be somewhere around $21,000. In other words, still a budget vehicle, but not quite as cheap as modern entry-level cars. When you account for the feature content, and the GT version which we're looking at here, cost somewhat more, but represented only about 1,380 of the total 3,564 Scamps produced, meaning roughly 39% of all Scamp buyers opted for the upgraded GT model. Now, one interesting interior feature of these Scamps is if you take a look just ahead of the door pull there's a little knob, and that is a twist knob for the door lock. There is no lock plunger on these door panels. You twist this little knob, it's almost like a glove box door latch, and that's how you lock or unlock the door. I just thought it was unconventional and worth pointing out. This unusual door lock mechanism was actually a cost-saving measure that eliminated the need for a separate lock plunger assembly and simplified the door panel construction. However, it also proved to be somewhat confusing for first-time passengers, who would often struggle to figure out how to lock or unlock the doors, which led to some amusing situations, according to period owner reports. The instrument panel was pure early 1980s Chrysler economy car fare, with a simple rectangular speedometer and fuel gauge housed in a plain black plastic binnacle. There was no tachometer on the base model, though the GT version, which we're looking at here, did include a full gauge cluster with tachometer whose numerals almost mirrored those of the speedometer, which was a bit unfortunate and probably confused at least several drivers. The GT dash also included a clock and an ammeter, though curiously, there was no temperature gauge or oil pressure gauge, both items you'd expect to find in anything marketed as a GT. The dashboard itself was constructed from hard black plastic with minimal padding and featured rectangular vents that were adjustable but felt somewhat flimsy in operation. The radio was an optional extra, and when equipped, it was a simple AM/FM unit with manual tuning, though 254 GT buyers splurged for the cassette player option, while nearly half of base Scamp buyers chose to skip the radio entirely and go with a blank plate. The overall impression was one of stark utilitarianism, but everything was logically laid out and easy to reach, which made the Scamp a practical daily driver, even if it wasn't particularly inspiring to look at. Transmission options on the Plymouth Scamp were interesting, as the base model could be had with a 4-speed manual as standard equipment, with an optional 3-speed automatic. However, the GT version, which accounts for roughly a third of all Scamps produced, came exclusively with either a 5-speed manual transmission or the 3-speed automatic that was dubbed the TorqueFlite A413, which was specifically designed for transverse front-wheel drive applications. The 5-speed manual transmission featured a floor-mounted shifter with relatively short throws, though the shift action was described in period reviews as somewhat notchy and imprecise. The clutch pedal effort was light, which made the Scamp easy to drive in stop-and-go traffic, and the clutch pedal itself had an unusually wide arm, which housed the clutch cable adjuster mechanism. Interestingly, the manual transmission was chosen over the automatic about 3-to-1 on the GT model, which suggests that buyers who opted for the sportier version actually wanted to row their own gears. And this preference for manuals was quite different from the broader market trend, which was already beginning to shift toward automatics even in the early 1980s. Now, under hood in these Plymouth Scamps, you had Chrysler's 2.2-liter overhead cam 4-cylinder engine that made somewhere between 85 and 99 horsepower, kind of in that range depending on the year and emission calibration. So not all that great, but it was a decent engine for what it was. The 2.2-liter displaced exactly 135 cubic inches and featured a cast-iron block with an aluminum cylinder head. The compression ratio was 9.0-to-1, and torque figures ranged from 111 to 119 pound-feet, depending on the specific calibration. What's particularly interesting is that while the Dodge Rampage briefly offered a turbocharged variant, the Plymouth Scamp came exclusively with the naturally aspirated version of the 2.2-liter engine throughout its entire single-year production run. The engine tended to be reasonably reliable in naturally aspirated form, though turbocharged versions in other Chrysler products had head gasket issues. But that wasn't a concern for Scamp buyers, since they never got the turbo option. The engine featured a single overhead camshaft, driven by a toothed rubber timing belt that required replacement every 50,000 miles or so, which was a maintenance item that many owners neglected, leading to catastrophic engine failure when the belt eventually snapped. Fuel delivery was handled by a 2-barrel Holley carburetor, which was the standard setup for the 1983 model year, though later L-body vehicles would receive throttle body fuel injection. What's particularly noteworthy about the Plymouth Scamp's engine is that it featured Plymouth-specific emission control calibrations that were slightly different from the Dodge versions due to different dealer network requirements and regional emission standards that Plymouth had to meet in certain markets where Dodge wasn't as strongly represented. Additionally, the Scamp never received a hood scoop on the base model, but the GT version did get a non-functional hood scoop that was purely decorative, though it did add a bit of visual aggression to an otherwise plain-looking vehicle. The engine bay was relatively cramped, as you'd expect from a transverse-mounted power plant. But Chrysler engineers did a reasonable job of packaging everything in an accessible manner. The battery was mounted on the driver's side of the engine bay, and the air cleaner housing sat atop the carburetor, occupying a significant amount of the available space. Routine maintenance items like the oil filter and spark plugs were reasonably accessible, though changing the timing belt required removing several components and was considered a moderately complex job, best left to someone with mechanical experience. The cooling system featured a cross-flow radiator mounted at the front of the vehicle, with an electric cooling fan that would cycle on and off based on coolant temperature. Overall, the 2.2-liter engine was reliable enough for daily transportation duties, though it certainly wasn't known for exceptional longevity, with many examples requiring significant repairs or rebuilds by the time they reached 100,000 miles. Air conditioning was an optional extra that was chosen by 620 of the 1,380 GT buyers, which represented a higher percentage than the base Scamp, where fewer buyers splurged for the AC option. The exhaust system was a simple single-pipe design that routed from the engine through a catalytic converter and then to a small muffler at the rear of the vehicle. The exhaust note was uninspiring at best, producing a somewhat raspy 4-cylinder sound that lacked any sort of character or sportiness. However, the relatively free-flowing exhaust design did help the engine breathe efficiently, which contributed to the Scamp's impressive fuel economy figures. The underside of the vehicle showed its car-based origins, with minimal ground clearance and no skid plates or other protective equipment that you'd find on a traditional body-on-frame pickup truck. The rear suspension was a simple beam axle design with leaf springs, which was unusual for a front-wheel drive vehicle, but made perfect sense for a pickup truck application. Where load-carrying capability was important, the leaf springs were relatively stiff, which meant that the unladen ride quality was somewhat harsh and choppy, particularly over rough pavement. However, when the bed was loaded with cargo, the suspension settled down and the ride quality improved noticeably, which was exactly the intended behavior for a working pickup truck. The rear axle featured drum brakes, which were adequate for the Scamp's modest weight and performance, though they required regular adjustment to maintain proper braking performance. The high stance of the body relative to the rear wheels when unladen was intentional to allow for suspension compression under load without the body bottoming out on the axle. Up front, the Scamp used a McPherson strut suspension with lower control arms and a stabilizer bar. This suspension design was borrowed directly from the Omni and Horizon passenger cars, and it provided reasonably competent handling for such an economy-focused vehicle. The front brakes were discs, which provided good stopping power and required less maintenance than drums. The steering was rack and pinion, which offered decent feedback and relatively quick responses, though there was some torque steer present during hard acceleration, particularly with the automatic transmission. The front suspension geometry was optimized more for ride comfort and economy than for sporting handling, which made sense given the Scamp's intended mission as a practical utility vehicle rather than a performance machine. The badging and graphics packages available on the Scamp were relatively simple, with most vehicles featuring the Plymouth script on the tailgate and the Scamp name in a casual italic font. Some examples came with colorful stripe packages that ran along the body sides, which added a bit of visual interest to the otherwise plain styling. The GT model featured additional badging, including GT emblems on the front fenders and tailgate, as well as unique wheel covers, or optional alloy wheels, and body-colored bumpers instead of the standard black units. Interestingly, only 2 GT buyers skipped the tape stripes entirely, opting for a completely plain appearance. The most popular color for GT models was crimson red, with 706 units, followed by formal black at 294 units, then charcoal gray at 194, and silver crystal at 160. These visual distinctions helped the GT stand out from the base model, though even the upgraded version was hardly what you'd call flashy or attention-grabbing. The overall aesthetic was very much in keeping with early 1980s automotive design trends, favoring straight lines and angular shapes over the more flowing organic forms that would become popular later in the decade. Now, advertising for the Plymouth Scamp was relatively minimal, as the vehicle was something of an afterthought, rushed to market to give Plymouth dealers something to compete with the Dodge Rampage. Most of the advertising budget went to the Dodge version, which had a 2-year head start and benefited from more extensive marketing campaigns. Dodge ads for the Rampage emphasized practicality and fuel economy, often highlighting performance figures like 0 to 50 miles per hour in 6.4 seconds. And why did they advertise 0 to 50 miles per hour? Well, number one, don't forget that during this time frame, the national speed limit was 55 miles per hour, so what sense does a 0 to 60 miles per hour test make? And then secondly, I don't think the car makers complained about the 0 to 50 miles per hour statistics because it made the vehicles seem faster. 0 to 50 in 6.4 seconds. Gosh, that sounds reasonably brisk. And of course, it really was not. This was a type of advertising that you saw on many different vehicles during this era, not just Chrysler products. The Plymouth Scamp likely shared similar performance characteristics, though specific figures for the Plymouth version are harder to find, given its limited production run and minimal marketing support. Fuel economy was one of the Plymouth Scamp's genuine strong points, as this was really one of the most fuel-efficient pickups that were offered on the marketplace. The EPA ratings for the L-body pickups were impressive, with highway figures in the mid to high 40s and city figures in the high 20s, depending on transmission choice and driving conditions. Of course, there were other competitive vehicles from VW and Subaru. The Subaru Brat. I love that name. And the VW Rabbit pickup. There were others as well, but those were some principal competitors. Regardless, you had a potentially very fuel-efficient pickup, lightweight, that could carry something and could get the job done and do so without costing much to operate. These fuel economy figures were achieved through a combination of factors, including the lightweight construction, with a curb weight of only around 2,300 pounds, the aerodynamic efficiency of the cab-forward design, and the relatively efficient 2.2-liter engine. In real-world driving, many owners reported achieving fuel economy in the mid-30s to low 40s miles per gallon range, which was truly exceptional for a vehicle with genuine cargo-carrying capability of 1,100 pounds. This made the Scamp an attractive option for small business owners, contractors, and anyone else who needed occasional hauling capability but didn't want to suffer the fuel economy penalties of a traditional full-size pickup truck. Now, unfortunately, it's clear that the Plymouth Scamp wasn't all that successful. Otherwise, why would it only last one model year? And I'm not quite sure why Plymouth wanted to step into this space. Perhaps dealers felt that they needed something to compete with the Dodge Rampage, offering that their crosstown Dodge rivals were selling. Or they were just jealous, and hence Plymouth brought it to market for that 1 year only, and really didn't change hardly anything versus the Dodge Rampage, just the front-end fascia a little bit, and a few other minor trim details. So it didn't cost much to bring to market, but it was a 1 year experiment that failed. The decision to create a Plymouth version was apparently made quite late in the development cycle, which explains why so little differentiation existed between the Scamp and Rampage. Plymouth dealers had been lobbying for their own version of the small pickup to compete with what Dodge dealers were offering, and Chrysler management finally relented for the 1983 model year, though they committed minimal resources to the project. The result was a vehicle that looked nearly identical to its Dodge counterpart and offered no compelling reason for buyers to choose Plymouth over Dodge. With sales of less than 10 units per day nationwide throughout the entire 1983 model year, it's clear that the Plymouth Scamp failed to capture consumer imagination or wallet share. And the Dodge Rampage really wasn't all that successful either. It only lasted 3 model years, from 1982 to 1984. And that was it for the end of the line on that particular vehicle too. And I suppose that it just is what it is. By the time these vehicles came out, fuel prices were starting to decline from their early 1980s peaks, and they would really hit a nadir in the mid and late 1980s. And so these fuel-efficient small pickups just weren't necessarily appropriate for the time. I would say if customers wanted to buy a more car-like pickup truck, they really were going to something like an El Camino or Ranchero that had a full frame underneath it that was rear-wheel drive. I think it was tough for American buyers to really accept this foreign car formula. Like I said, VW and Subaru had something similar here with their own small car-based pickups. But unibody and front-wheel drive was tough for pickup truck buyers to accept, as they didn't think they could really do much serious work with it, despite the fact that the payload capacity was actually quite respectable. Others, like Jeep, did have a unibody pickup, the Comanche of course, that was rear-wheel drive or four-wheel drive. And it wasn't all that successful relative to the Cherokee SUV or the CJ7 and Wrangler off-road vehicles really, because pickup buyers were skeptical of the unibody construction. The market timing was simply unfortunate, as the Scamp arrived just as the fuel crisis of the late 1970s and early 1980s was subsiding, and consumers were beginning to return to larger, more traditional vehicles. Additionally, the Ford Ranger and Chevrolet S10 compact pickups were gaining traction, offering more conventional rear-wheel drive body-on-frame construction with available four-wheel drive and extended cab configurations that the Scamp simply couldn't match. Today, the Plymouth Scamp stands as one of the rarest and most unusual vehicles ever produced by Chrysler Corporation, with only 3,564 examples built during its single model year production run, making it far rarer than most exotic sports cars of the era. Finding a survivor today is extraordinarily difficult, and well-preserved examples are increasingly sought after by collectors. With GT models commanding a premium due to their additional features and even greater rarity, the market has seen a slight uptick in appreciation for these quirky pickups as nostalgia for 1980s vehicles grows among collectors, and the Scamp's extreme rarity certainly works in its favor. These vehicles represent a fascinating footnote in automotive history, a time when American manufacturers were willing to experiment with unconventional formats and take risks on unusual products. Even if those risks didn't always pay off commercially, the Scamp may not have been beautiful, with its anteater underbite fascia and awkward proportions, and it certainly wasn't powerful, with its naturally aspirated 2.2-liter four-cylinder, making less than 100 horsepower. But it was innovative, practical, and genuinely different from anything else on the market. And for those reasons alone, it deserves to be remembered and appreciated. So, what do you think of the Plymouth Scamp? The one-year-only Plymouth Scamp. Had you heard of it before? It remains one of Chrysler's most obscure and forgotten vehicles, yet it represents an important chapter in the company's history. During a tumultuous period of transition and experimentation, when fuel economy and efficiency were paramount concerns, and traditional automotive formulas were being challenged and reimagined in ways both successful and unsuccessful.